A name that shook the world. 200 years ago, in the grasslands above the Indian Ocean coast of southern Africa, a man united dozens of scattered clans into one of the most formidable kingdoms the continent had ever seen. Zai, Timbetoti. His name was Shaka. In a little over a decade as king of the Zulu, he rebuilt an army, remade warfare in his region, and made his people's name known across continents. Today that name still carries enormous weight in South Africa, across Africa, and in popular culture around the world. But alongside the real history, a legend grew, wild, lurid, and largely invented. Colonial-era adventurers exaggerated his violence to suit their own purposes. A 1986 television series reached millions and cemented images that owed more to drama than to evidence. This book sets out to find the real Shaka, the young man who survived a difficult childhood, the military thinker who changed the rules of warfare, the king whose reign was brief and whose death came from betrayal, not conquest. We will separate what the sources tell us from what has been imagined, and meet, at last, one of history's most compelling figures as he actually was. Chapter 2. A world of many nations. Long before Shaka was born, the coastal plains and inland hills of what is now KwaZulu-Natal were home to a rich and varied world. The northern Nguni-speaking peoples lived in extended family homesteads called imizi, circular clusters of beehive-shaped grass, huts arranged around a central cattle enclosure. Cattle were not merely livestock. They were wealth, spiritual currency, and the foundation of social life. These communities were not isolated. Trade in iron, beads, and cattle linked clans across the region. And the 1700s saw a gradual process of larger polities, forming as stronger chiefs absorbed smaller ones. This was not empty land waiting to be discovered. It was a complex, well-organized society with its own histories, laws, and arts of governance. The Zulu were, at the start of the 19th century, one of the smaller of these clans, a few thousand people under a minor chief, living on the upper white Mthethwa River. No one looking at them around 1800 could have predicted what would come next. Understanding the world that made Shaka means starting here, in this living, breathing community of nations. Chapter 3. The Great Chiefdoms before Shaka. 2 chiefdoms towered above the rest in the region around 1800. To the south lay the Mthethwa paramountcy, led by a shrewd and innovative chief named Ndwandwe. To the north, the Ndwandwe under their chief Swide were equally powerful and more aggressive. Between them and among them jostled dozens of smaller clans, including the Zulu. Ndwandwe was already experimenting with ideas that would later define Shaka's kingdom, organizing young men into age-based regiments, reducing the lethality of warfare to limit casualties, and building alliances through cattle and marriage rather than constant destruction. He was, by the accounts that reach us, a sophisticated political mind. Mbaki. It was in his service that a young man named Shaka would receive his military education. These 2 great chiefdoms, and the tension between them, form the stage on which Shaka's story unfolds. The region was already in motion, already producing larger, more centralized states before Shaka ever led a regiment. His genius was to accelerate and deepen a process already underway. Chapter 4. A difficult beginning. Shaka was born around 1787, the son of Senzangakona, chief of the small Zulu clan, and a woman named Nandi from the neighboring Langini people. Their union was considered irregular under the customs of the time, and when tensions rose between the households, Nandi and her young son were sent away. Mother and child lived among her Langini relatives for several years, and the sources suggest, though details vary and come mainly from oral testimony gathered long after the fact, that the boy's outsider status made his early years hard. He and Nandi eventually found shelter with the Mthethwa people, where Shaka came of age. These years of displacement appear in many accounts of Shaka's life, sometimes used to explain everything that followed. But we should be careful. The early life is poorly documented, remembered through oral tradition, and filtered through later retelling. What we can say is that by his late teens, Shaka was a young man of the Mthethwa world, about to enter a military system that would transform him. Chapter 5. The School of Ndwandwe. Around 1809, Shaka joined the Mthethwa army as a warrior under Ndwandwe. For roughly 6 years he served, trained, and distinguished himself. Ndwandwe's forces were organized into amabutho, age-based regiments in which young men of similar age trained, lived, and fought together. This system bound warriors to the state, rather than to their individual homesteads, creating loyalty upward to the paramount chief. Shaka absorbed every part of it. He also began to think about how fighting could be done better. Traditional warfare in the region involved throwing long-hafted spears at a distance, and then often withdrawing. Casualties were usually limited. Shaka, by the accounts of those who later described his thinking, was drawn towards something more decisive, closing the distance, disabling the enemy's shield, and ending the encounter quickly. He is credited with championing a shorter, heavier stabbing spear, the iklwa, suited for close quarters. Whether this innovation was entirely his or already in development is debated by historians, but his advocacy for it, and for the tactics that went with it, appears genuine. Chapter 6. The iklwa and the New Way of War. The weapon Shaka championed would become synonymous with Zulu warfare, the iklwa, a short-shafted stabbing spear with a broad, leaf-shaped iron blade. Unlike the longer assegai that warriors typically threw, the iklwa was designed for close combat. It was paired with a large cowhide shield, the isilangu, which in Shaka's tactics became an active weapon in itself. A trained warrior would hook his shield behind his opponents, twist it to expose the enemy's left side, and drive the iklwa home. The technique demanded fitness, nerve, and close-range courage. To train for it, Shaka reportedly banned sandals, hardening his warriors' feet until they could cover ground at a pace that astonished opponents. These changes were not magic. They required an enemy who did not know how to respond, and opponents adapted over time. But in the crucial decade of Shaka's expansion, when his reformed regiments faced chiefs who still relied on older methods, the advantage was decisive. The iklwa became the symbol of a new military era. Chapter 7. King of the Zulu. In 1816, Shaka's father Senzangakona died. With Ndwandwe's backing, Shaka moved quickly to claim the Zulu chieftaincy, eliminating a rival claimant. He was now chief of a small clan, but his ambition and his sponsor's power gave him room to act. He immediately began restructuring the Zulu fighting force along the lines of what he had learned, and improved upon in Mthethwa service, age-regiment organization, intensive training, the iklwa and large shield, and new tactical thinking. His authority over the regiments was absolute. They were loyal to him, not to their homesteads. Then, in 1818, the political world around him shifted violently. Ndwandwe was captured and killed by the Ndwandwe chief's wide. The Mthethwa paramountcy collapsed, and the region was suddenly without its dominant power. Into that vacuum Shaka moved, not merely as a Zulu chief, but as the heir to Mthethwa authority, drawing many former Mthethwa people to his side. The Zulu kingdom, as a major power, was born in this crisis, built on loss and opportunity in almost equal measure. Chapter 8. Chest and Horns. The tactical formation that came to define Zulu warfare under Shaka is known as Impondo Zankamo, the Horns of the Bull. It divided a fighting force into 4 groups. The chest was the main body that engaged the enemy head-on. The 2 horns swept around both sides, encircling the opponent before they could withdraw. The loins, a reserve held back and seated with their backs to the battle to keep them calm and fresh, were released wherever the line needed reinforcement. Coordinated over wide terrain without modern communications, The formation demanded intense training, discipline, and a shared understanding among commanders. Its elegance lay in converting a battle into a trap. The enemy found themselves fighting on 3 sides at once. Historians note that similar encircling tactics appear in other military traditions, and Shaka's version evolved over time rather than arriving fully formed. What is certain is that in the hands of well-drilled Zulu regiments against opponents who had not seen it before, the formation was devastatingly effective, and it is documented in enough independent sources to be accepted as genuinely his. Chapter 9. Building the Kingdom. Victory over the Ndwandwe in a series of battles between 1818 and 1820, culminating in a decisive encounter at the Mthethwa's River, established Shaka as the dominant power in the region. Clan after clan was absorbed into the growing Zulu kingdom, some through conquest, many through diplomacy and the offer of protection. Absorbed peoples were not simply enslaved or exterminated. They were incorporated. Their young men entered the amabutho. Their chiefs became subordinates. Their cattle were redistributed through the royal system. This process of incorporation was one of the most distinctive features of Shaka's kingdom building, and helps explain how it grew so rapidly. He also established a network of amakanda, royal military homesteads dotted across the kingdom, each commanded by a trusted official or royal relative. These functioned simultaneously as military barracks, centers of royal authority, and nodes of economic control. The kingdom that emerged was genuinely new, not simply a larger version of a traditional chiefdom, but something more centralized, more militarized, and more administratively complex. Chapter 10. The World Shaka Made. By the early 1820s, the Zulu kingdom stretched across a wide swath of what is now KwaZulu-Natal. Shaka ruled from his principal royal homestead, eventually the Great Kwabulawayo, overseeing a state that was simultaneously military camp, court, and capital. He controlled cattle redistribution on a massive scale. Cattle flowed into the royal herds as tribute and were redistributed by the king as reward, creating a loyalty system based on calculated generosity. The amabutho regiments remained the backbone of the state. Young men spent their most vigorous years in royal service before being permitted to marry, and established their own households, a permission granted collectively by the king. This gave Shaka both a standing army and a mechanism of social control. He was not unique in these methods. Other rulers in the region used similar tools, but the scale and consistency of their application under Shaka were new. Trade with the outside world, including early contacts with European traders at Port Natter, latter Durban, also began during his reign, opening connections to markets and materials that would become significant for his successors. Chapter 11. The First Europeans. Among the first Europeans to reach Shaka's court were a small number of English traders who had settled at Port Natal from around 1824. 2 of them, Henry Francis Fynn and Nathaniel Isaacs, left written accounts of what they witnessed, accounts that would become the primary English language sources on Shaka's reign. This matters enormously because both men had reasons to distort what they saw and remembered. Finn's so-called diary was not a daily record, but a reconstruction written years later, and Isaacs explicitly urged Fynn in a letter that was later discovered to make Shaka and his successor as bloodthirsty as you can. The colonial project that followed Shaka's death benefited from a picture of Zulu brutality. It made conquest easier to justify and land easier to claim. Historians using the James Stuart Archive, a vast collection of Zulu oral testimony gathered in the early 20th century, have found that Zulu voices paint a more complex, more human, and often quite different portrait of the same events. When you read anything about Shaka's supposed atrocities, the first question to ask is, who wrote it and why? Chapter 12. What the Zulu sources say. The most important counterweight to the colonial written sources is the James Stuart Archive, a remarkable collection of oral testimonies gathered between the 1890s and 1920s by James Stuart, a colonial official who understood that Zulu oral history was in danger of being lost. Stuart interviewed hundreds of Zulu men and women, including elderly people who had direct family memory of Shaka's time. Their accounts, now published in multiple volumes, give us Zulu voices on Zulu history. These testimonies do not present Shaka as a saint. They record military campaigns, the power of life and death he wielded as king, and the fear that surrounded him. But they also reveal a ruler who was remembered as just in many of his judgments, who took counsel, who rewarded loyalty generously, and whose personal courage was admired. The oral sources contradict many of the most extreme claims made by Fynn and Isaacs. The picture that emerges from comparing all the sources is of a formidable, complex, and sometimes ruthless king, not the sadistic monster of colonial imagination, and not a faultless hero either. The truth, as always, is harder and more interesting than the legend. Chapter 13. The Mthethwa, A Disputed History. The early 19th century was a period of intense disruption across a wide area of southern Africa. Many communities were displaced, some destroyed, others fled hundreds of kilometers to new lands. This era is called the Mthethwa, roughly the crushing in Zulu and the Ndwandwe in Sesotho. For most of the 20th century, historians blamed Shaka. His wars, the argument went, sent a wave of violence rolling across the region. That picture has been fundamentally revised. Scholars now recognize that upheaval was already underway before Shaka's rise, driven partly by competition over land and cattle, partly by the destabilizing effects of the Delagoa Bay slave trade and early colonial pressure at the Cape. Other polities, besides the Zulu, were involved in raiding and displacement. Shaka's expansion contributed to the disruption. This much is clear, but the old Shaka caused the Mthethwa. Story was an oversimplification that conveniently shifted blame onto an African ruler and away from colonial dynamics already at work. Most contemporary historians reject both the Shaka-centric explanation and more extreme counterclaims. The honest answer is that the Mthethwa had multiple causes. Chapter 14. The Power of the King. Shaka ruled as an absolute monarch, and the sources, both colonial and Zulu, agree that his authority over life and death was real and exercised. He held the power to execute, and he used it. His military campaigns required discipline. Warriors who broke ranks or showed cowardice faced severe consequences. The accounts differ widely, however, on scale. Fynn and Isaacs made claims of mass killing on a staggering and sensational scale. Zulu oral sources suggest a king capable of severity, but whose judgments were often more calibrated than the colonial accounts allow. A critical point, Shaka ruled without the institutions, law courts, written codes, appeals processes that modern readers use as benchmarks. Every pre-modern monarchy exercised power over life and death in ways that look brutal by contemporary standards. Judging Shaka by those standards, while not applying the same scrutiny to the violent colonial conquest that followed him, is a form of double standard. This book does not excuse real cruelty wherever it can be documented, but it insists on applying the same critical eye to all the sources. Chapter 15. Nandi. Among the figures closest to Shaka, none appears more consistently than his mother, Nandi. She had shared his difficult early years, expelled from the Zulu homestead, dependent on relatives, finding shelter, and eventually a place in the Mthethwa world. When Shaka became king, Nandi rose with him. She became a senior figure at court, respected and powerful, and the sources suggest he held genuine affection for her. In 1827, she died. What followed is one of the most contested passages in Shaka's story. The colonial accounts describe a period of terrible mourning, mass executions of people who did not grieve visibly enough, prohibitions on planting and milk, killings of pregnant women. These claims, coming principally from Fynn and Isaacs, need to be treated with the caution now applied to everything those men wrote. Zulu sources acknowledge a period of severe public mourning and real hardship. National grief was ritualized and enforced in ways that were consistent with the customs of the period. Whether the extremes described by the colonial writers happened as stated is genuinely uncertain. What is beyond doubt is that after Nandi's death, Shaka's behavior became more erratic and his commanders more restless. Chapter 16. The Gathering Storm. By 1828, Shaka's reign was entering its most difficult phase. He had dispatched his armies on a long, costly campaign northward toward Delagoa Bay, with heavy losses to disease and exhaustion rather than enemy action. The warriors who returned were depleted and dispirited. Shaka began planning yet another expedition, and the commanders who had served him were reaching the limits of their endurance. Meanwhile, his authority showed signs of becoming less predictable. Two of his half-brothers, Ndwandwe and Mthethwa, had both survived the years in the shadow of a king who trusted few people and could order death without appeal. Around them, and around Shaka's personal attendant, Mbopa, dissatisfaction gathered quietly. The word in the sources is not rebellion so much as exhaustion and fear. Shaka, by several accounts, had begun to predict his own death, or so the later telling has it. Whether that is memory or hindsight layered onto the story is impossible now to say. What is certain is that in September 1828, the storm broke. Chapter 17. Dukuza, September 1828. On 22 September 1828, at his royal homestead of Kwadukuza, Shaka was assassinated. The killers were his half-brothers Ndwandwe and Mthethwa, acting together with his personal attendant Mopa. The accounts of the moment differ in detail. The sources were not eyewitnesses in the ordinary sense, but all agree on the essential fact: he was stabbed, and he died there. He was around 41 years old. After reigning for barely 12 years, the man who had built the Zulu kingdom from a minor clan into a regional power was gone. Ndwandwe moved swiftly to take the throne, executing Mthethwa shortly afterwards to remove a rival. Shaka's body was buried at Kwadukuza, and the site is commemorated today as a heritage landmark in the town, now known by the same name. The kingdom he had built did not die with him. The amabutho system, the territorial organization, and the centralized monarchy all survived, holding together a state that would outlast its founder's brief, turbulent reign by decades. Chapter 18. The Legend and the Screen. Shaka did not disappear from history when he died. If anything, his image grew larger and more distorted with time. The colonial era accounts of Isaacs and Fynn, with their agenda of sensationalism, were for a long time the dominant sources in English. In 1986, a South African television series aired internationally, reaching millions of viewers with the dramatized Shaka, powerful, but also shaped by political contexts that had nothing to do with history. Historians noted that the series served the purposes of the apartheid-era South African Broadcasting Corporation in complicated ways, and that its Shaka was as much an invention as any other. The serious scholarship came later. Carolyn Hamilton's 1998 study Terrific Majesty examined carefully how the image of Shaka had been constructed and weaponized by different interests over 2 centuries. Her conclusion, and the consensus of the field, is that we can know a great deal about the real Shaka, but only if we are honest about which sources to trust and why the legend is interesting. The history is more so. Chapter 19. Legacy, the nation he made. The kingdom Shaka built outlasted him by half a century. His successors, Ndwandwe, Mande, and then Cetshwayo, held the Zulu kingdom together through decades of increasing pressure from Boer settlers and British colonial forces. In 1879, the Anglo-Zulu War brought British regiments face-to-face with Zulu warriors, using many of the tactics Shaka had pioneered. At the Battle of Ndwandwe, a British column was annihilated in one of the most dramatic military reversals of the Victorian era. The Zulu kingdom was eventually broken by British force and political maneuver, but it was never forgotten. Today, South Africa's province of KwaZulu-Natal takes its name in part from the kingdom Shaka forged. Heritage Day, on 24 September, is celebrated as Shaka Day. The town of Kadukuza, where he died, carries his memory in its streets and heritage sites. The Zulu royal family continues, connected by living lineage to the king who started it all. Shaka's innovations in military organization, statecraft, and the unification of diverse peoples into a coherent national identity, these are his real legacy, more durable than any legend. Chapter 20. What we really know. So what do we really know about Shaka? We know he was born around 1787, the son of a minor Zulu chief, and spent his formative years in the Mthethwa kingdom. We know he came to power in 1816, defeated the Ndwandwe, and built one of the most formidable states in southern African history. We know he innovated in military tactics, the iklwa, the large shield, the chest, and horns formation, and organized his kingdom around an age-regiment system that was both army and administration. We know he was capable of severity, and that his authority over life and death was real. We also know that the most lurid accounts of his violence come from men with documented reasons to exaggerate, and that Zulu oral sources give us a more nuanced picture. The honest verdict is this: a brilliant, driven, and sometimes ruthless king who achieved something extraordinary in a short reign, surrounded by a myth that has served everyone's purposes except the truth's. He deserves better than the legend. He deserves to be known as he was complex, consequential, and entirely, unmistakably real. A note on history and sources. The history of Shaka Zulu is inseparable from the problem of its sources. The principal written accounts in English, those of Henry Francis Fynn and Nathaniel Isaacs, were produced by men with documented colonial agendas, who encouraged each other to exaggerate. A letter from Isaacs to Fynn, discovered later, explicitly urged him to make Shaka as bloodthirsty as you can. This does not mean nothing they wrote is true, but it means everything they wrote requires verification against other sources. The most important alternative source is the James Stuart Archive. Hundreds of oral testimonies gathered from Zulu men and women in the early 20th century, many of whom had family memory of Shaka's time. Tanyu Chen. Published in 6 volumes by Colin Webb and John Wright University of Natal Press, 1976 to 2001. This archive provides Zulu voices on Zulu history and substantially complicates the colonial picture. Carolyn Hamilton's Terrific Majesty, The Powers of Shaka Zulu and the Limits of Historical Invention, Harvard University Press, 1998, remains the landmark scholarly study of how the Shaka image was constructed and why it matters. The debate around the Mthethwa, the period of disruption in early 19th century Southern Africa, is ongoing. Historians, including Julian Cobbing, challenged the Shaka-centric explanation in the 1980s, arguing that colonial factors were more important. Most scholars today hold a position between the old Shaka blaming narrative and the most revisionist counterclaims, multiple causes, multiple actors, a complex era. Where this book states something as documented fact, it is supported by the sources listed below. Where it acknowledges uncertainty, debate, or legend, it does so in the text. The 1986 television series Shaka Zulu is popular culture, not history. It dramatized, invented, and was shaped by the political context of apartheid South Africa. It is not used as a source here. The illustrations in this book are artistic interpretations created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. They are not photographs or historical portraits. About Griot. Griot tells the true stories of African and Black history with the care they deserve, researched, sourced, and beautifully illustrated. If this book has made you curious, look for more in the series. Copyright 2026. Published independently via Griot.